Thank you for that very satisfying introduction, if a little over the top. I'm very happy to be giving the Haskins lecture, so I'd like at the outset to thank all those people who had anything to do with my selection. When I received Pauline's invitation, I was in the midst of teaching a course for the UCL Economics Department. Now, you may well ask, why would an econ department allow a statistic-challenged historian in its classroom? It was an emergency. They unexpectedly needed an instructor for a history of economic theory course scheduled to begin in a month. Their chair remembered that I had recently written a history of capitalism. I hadn't taught in a decade, but the prospect of doing so with 100 econ students was too intriguing to turn down. Composing a Haskins lecture promotes reflection, but reflection is rarely random. Mine focused on just why I would have written a history of capitalism. I am not an economic historian. Neil Ferguson, in a TLS review that would be a stretch to call favorable, noted archly that my pages were unsullied by a single table or graph. If I had to choose a rubric for myself, I would pick intellectual historian, one for whom the impact of economic development upon the way people interpreted their world has exercised an enduring fascination. This abiding interest in how people responded to changes in their everyday experience has something to do with growing up during the Depression. When my family drove into downtown Omaha, where I lived as a child, my father would always point out the long lines of people standing outside soup kitchens. In the darkest years, men came to our back door asking for food. My mother would fry a couple of eggs and toast some bread. This scene catapults us back to an America that is hardly imaginable today. One of my earliest memories was hearing Franklin Roosevelt speak in 1932 at the Omaha Cow Palace, the Exarban. The name Exarban, I hasten to tell you, is Nebraska spelled backwards. At age 3, the most thrilling thing about that event was the revolver on the hip of a policeman at my eye level. But I also recall the raw excitement of the crowd. I came from a divided family. Democrats on my father's side, Republicans on my mother's. My father's father had been a friend and partisan of William Jennings Bryan. He was one of Bryan's nominators in the 1900 convention. My mother's father was a land speculator, buying property from Kearney, Nebraska, where my parents met, to Cripple Creek, Colorado, and on to San Francisco, then a part of what was called the Far West. Summers we visited my father's sisters, both of whom were fanatic FDR supporters. One kept a great scrapbook filled with clippings of Roosevelt's campaigns. By this time, my father, a businessman, was putting some distance between him and his populist roots. He and his sisters would argue politics well into the night in these visits. And listening, I realized that my aunts were speaking from deeply felt convictions, whereas my father was more baiting them than sharing his beliefs. About this same time, I worked for the paper at Haven Junior High School in Evanston, Illinois. And I learned then that writing was something that I wanted to do. I also had a strong sense that you were taken more seriously if you were paid for what you did. And being the youngest in my family, being taken seriously was very important. When I graduated from college in 1950, society spoke very clearly about what I should want to do. I should want to become a wife and mother as quickly as possible. I'd spent the last 3 months as a bridesmaid in my friends' weddings. But Mademoiselle magazine saved me from this destiny. I was one of 20 College Board contest winners brought back to New York City to put out their big August back-to-school issue. I then stayed on with the Mademoiselle advertising department. Since their office was on Madison Avenue, I suppose that made me a mad woman. The job put me on the periphery of a glamorous world, riding up in the elevator with notables like Truman Capote. But fashion and advertising were much too frivolous for me. Publishing, I thought, would be better. At least I would be close to serious writers. So I fired off letters to every publisher listed in the New York City directory. That is to say, the telephone directory. A young Harold McGraw Jr. offered me a job, but before I could get started at McGraw-Hill, convention pulled me back to Los Angeles to be married. My telephone directory approach to job hunting had worked so well in New York that I tried it again in Los Angeles, though there were many fewer publishers. But I did get one call from the Western Hotel and Restaurant Reporter, a trade magazine run out of a realtor's office in Beverly Hills. A few minutes into my interview there, the cigar-smoking realtor said to me, "Well, you can have it." "What is it?" I asked, somewhat abashed. "The editor's job," he replied. I was ecstatic, even after I discovered that I also did layouts, delivered copy to the printer, and sent out subscription notices. After the birth of my first child and a move to Pasadena, I got a job with the Star News as their South Pasadena stringer. This was part-time and could be done from home by calling each morning for a review of the police blotter. But I also attended Board of Education and city council meetings. I'm telling you all this because the story of why I became an historian is tied up with why I didn't become a journalist. One day, something exciting actually took place in South Pasadena. A 14-year-old boy had shot and injured a friend of his while the two of them were playing around with guns. The city editor ordered me to hightail it over to his home, the wounded teenager's home, and get a picture of him for the next day's paper. The house was less than a mile away. When I rang the doorbell, an elderly woman answered. I explained my mission. She identified herself as the victim's grandmother and invited me in. I could see the boy's framed photo on the mantel the minute I stepped inside. I gave her my request, and she seemed about to comply with it, but then had second thoughts. The boy's parents were at the hospital. What if something happened to her grandson? And they returned and learned that his beloved picture was gone and she'd given it away. I knew what I should do. I had seen Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur's play Front Page, where the reporters stole corpses and sequestered criminals. If I wanted to join their tribe, I needed to push past Grandma, grab the photo, and exit quickly. Instead, I commiserated with her. I agreed that the parents might feel awful it were gone. I retreated slowly from the living room, without the photo, but with a critical insight about myself. I didn't have the brassy spirit to be a reporter. It was at that point that I remembered my love of history and the fact that historians also wrote. 2 more children, another move, and I enrolled in a PhD program at Claremont Graduate School. I was on a very short tether. Had there not been a PhD granting institution nearby, I would not have become an academic. Fortunately, there was, and I got to work with 3 superb scholars, the eminent colonial historian Douglas Adair, the doyen of American church history, Sidney Mead, and the political scientist Martin Diamond. In guiding me, Adair stressed that anyone who knew only American history didn't know it very well. By that, he meant that you needed knowledge of the countries that had shaped the European settlements in the New World. So I studied England and France in the 17th and 18th centuries as well. And this stood me in good stead, for it opened up the option of going where my curiosity led me later on. In my dissertation, I followed the impact of American nation building upon French and English politicians in the opening months of the French Revolution. It was a topic I could handle from Escondido, California, after a 2 weeks of document gathering in the East. Titled An American Pamphlet in Paris, it explored the way a party of Frenchmen, who styled themselves Américains, used the sudden prestige of the new nation to gain their own political goals. The Américains turned the 56-page examination of government into 291-page annotated translation with which to bludgeon the Anglomanes who favored a bicameral legislature for the new French National Assembly. Though the pamphlet's author had said nothing about a unicameral legislature, he excoriated civil privileges with a rousing endorsement of democratic self-government. That was enough for those dead set against a Gallic version of the British Parliament. I was entering the profession at a good time. That is, when I started teaching at San Diego State in 1967. Male professors in the humanities were far more welcoming to female colleagues than their peers in other fields. Still, my identification was as a wife and mother who luckily got to leave home Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays to teach 4 classes. I think a lot about curiosity, as Pauline noticed. It lies behind all that we know. I used to tell my students that everything they had learned in college was an answer to someone's question. We continue to write freshly about the past because each cohort of young people brings a different set of questions to it. And we're still ignorant about a lot of things because no one has thought to ask about them. This became apparent to me in 1968 when I organized a book exhibit to accompany a program for high school teachers on the brand new subject of African American history. Again, I wrote every publisher, something of a recurring impulse with me, requesting copies of any titles they had on the subject. I got back a motley assortment, little of it scholarly. Today, it would take 3 large rooms to hold all the publications on the African American experience because thousands of historians have inquired about it. My husband watched me get a PhD and decided that he wanted one too. We had met in a Western Civ class. Quite unexpectedly, this gave me a second graduate education. My professors had been older than I, whereas Andy's were in their 20s and early 30s. They were immersed in the methods and topics that were finally liberating history writing from the gentlemanly restraints imposed by the 19th century WASPs from Ivy League schools. While I was composing my first lectures, Andy would come home talking about models and cohorts and data. The word model brought to my mind the balsa wood airplanes that little boys fabricated. This new vocabulary, these concepts challenged me. No, they threatened me. Here I was, a newly minted PhD, made to feel obsolete by a graduate student, even if it was my husband. But I learned a lot from his mentors secondhand. The introductory course in American history at San Diego State proved to be critical for my future scholarship. We taught it in multiple small discussion sections, all using the same text. The People Shall Judge featured documents from the liberal canon, starting with Puritan sermons, moving on to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, and then crossing the Atlantic permanently with its revolutionary pamphlets and the Federalist Papers. In teaching, I uncovered the gaps in my knowledge, but what was even more intriguing was the lacuna in the documentary record. In the early 17th century, Puritans railed against men and women for being impulsive, untrustworthy, and bathed in sin. Fast forward a century and a half, and Smith treated them as steady self-improvers, rationally pursuing their interests. This striking transformation raised the question of when and how this reversal had taken place. Andy's research sent us to London for a year, where I could find the text that would reveal the metamorphosis of the fickle, wayward men and women of A Midsummer Night's Dream into the sober truck and barterers of the wealth of nations. I looked first at the growing commentary on the novel practices that were fashioning a market economy in England during the 17th century. The British Museum had an abundant collection of books and pamphlets and broadsides, which I got to peruse in that same lovely reading room with the pale blue chairs and desk pads where Karl Marx had written Das Kapital. One of the clues to my puzzle was that Smith never made an argument for his depiction of how the profit-oriented butcher and baker reacted to competition. He talked assuredly about the uniform, constant, and uninterrupted effort of every man to better his condition. He declared that the principle that prompts to save is the desire of bettering our condition that comes with us from the womb and never leaves us till we go into the grave. Edmund Burke echoed Smith's assumption. A theory like yours, founded on the nature of man, which is always the same, will last, he confided to his friend, when those that are founded on opinions which are always changing will and must be forgotten. I'm sure that Smith was unaware that these sentiments had not always been common, because the seismic shift from Puritan sinners to Smith's rational bargainers had taken place 2 generations before he was born. Then, over several decades, writers, watching people in their market relations, began to describe them as dependably calculating and reasonable. What started as an interpretation of conduct in the economic realm became universalized. All men are merchants, from the king to the peasant, one pamphleteer noted. Others claimed that trade is in its nature free, finds its own channel, and best directs its own course. Slowly crept in the notion that economic relations belong to nature, not public policy. Order came about spontaneously, often guided by the law of unintended consequences. Few things are more exhilarating than to find voices in the past that confirm your hunches. Hobbes and Locke had laid the basis for thinking of individualism as natural. It soon became an unexamined assumption for Anglo-Americans. But contemporaries recognized the novelty in their assertions. Methinks that Mr. Hobbes discourses of men as if they were terragene, born out of the earth, come up like seeds, without any relation one to the other, wrote a skeptical reader of the Leviathan, when by nature man was made a poor, helpless child who must trust and submit to his parents. Locke's placing the fundamentals of the economy in the state of nature prompted another critic to mock him for pretending that the government had no more power in politicals than they have in naturals. I checked my footnotes for economic thought and ideology in the 17th century, the book that came out of this research. I checked them at the Baker Library at Harvard's Business School, so I didn't have to cross the Atlantic again. There I got a demonstration of the value of my having written it in isolation from other scholars. The library had shown my manuscript to a distinguished European historian of banking, Fritz Redlich. One morning, Redlich, who was quite small and very old, approached me with a large volume of a German biographical dictionary weighing him down. Pointing at one of the entries, a 19th century German economist, he said to me, "He's done it. He's already done it." More supportively, Albro Martin, who was then the editor of the Business History Review, told me how happy it made him to learn that Smith was standing on the shoulders of so many men when so many other people were standing on his. Smith's view of human nature not only prevailed in economics, it shaped how people thought about human nature in general. Most English speakers shared his presumption that the innate striving for freedom and self-improvement drove events. Historians gave some attention to superstition, but it was always seen as indicative of backwardness and capable of correction. Ideas were hammered out on the anvil of truth. People were in charge of the contents of their mind. I grew up in a culture which battened off nature. Nature, not society, discriminated among races. Nature dictated the destiny of women. The economy was a natural system based on innate human traits, and it was capable naturally of regaining equilibrium after shocks to its system. My long exposure to the Depression made this latter point suspect, but the evocation of nature to define women's role incited me more, because I knew that this depiction of women's essence was not true. And therefore, I entertained doubts about other assertions my society made about what was natural. Burke's encomium to Smith was wrong, I decided. Human nature is not always the same. Though I didn't know the term at the time, I had actually been investigating the social construction of reality, the one that had dominated Western thought since the Enlightenment. While I was completing my book on English economic thought, a new construction of reality was being put in place in my field of early America. Bernard Bailyn had banished the rather banal idea that American colonists had rebelled against taxation in his ideological Origins of the American Revolution. In its place, he elaborated a particular mindset that had compelled the colonial gentry to construe imperial reforms as illegitimate acts imposed by a corrupt British authority. The classical Republican convictions that Bailyn ascribed to Americans' founders drew on a vocabulary of political pathology to predict tyranny, chaos, conspiracies, and usurpations. Locke was turned into an eccentric figure, the center now being held by an inherited way of interpreting events, harking back to Renaissance fears about power lusts. Classical republicanism involves several propositions: that change generally brought about degeneration or worse, and that history pointed to the instability of all political orders. Civic virtue, where leaders put the common good above their own interests, formed the only bulwark against decay. In closing his creation of the American Republic, Gordon Wood wrote that American republicanism represented a final attempt to come to terms with the emergent individualistic society that threatened to destroy once and for all the communion and benevolence that civilized man had always considered to be the ideal. Highlighting the ideological rather than the intellectual origins of the American Revolution signaled that historians had lit on a way of ditching the rational actor while simultaneously scraping marks off the concept of ideology. Sociologist Talcott Parsons and anthropologist Clifford Geertz helped here. Parsons taught historians to look at society as a structure of structures, familial, political, and religious, each reinforcing the other. He also gave them Max Weber, whose writings he translated. Weber attributed to human beings an inner necessity to comprehend the world as a meaningful cosmos and to know what attitude to take before it. Geertz built on this intuitive notion in his elegant Ideology as a Cultural System. Man, he announced, and I always presumed he meant to include women, is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. Culture was losing its connotation of cultivated tastes and beginning to take on the conceptual burden of explaining everything. J.G.A. Pocock gave it an epistemological twist when he wrote, "Men cannot do what they have no means of saying they have done, and what they do must in part be what they can say and conceive that it is." Geertz, whose field was Indonesia, also offered an explanation for why American leaders adhered to classical Republican thought. Ideologies, he wrote, emerge and take hold when societies free themselves from the governance of tradition. Geertz thrilled historians with his thick description of the connecting threads in the fabric of meaning that passed under the radar of critical inspection. His aphoristic flourishes were irresistible. The UC Irvine History Department used to have a spring program on social history. Commenting one year on a paper that Lawrence Stone had just delivered, I solemnly declared that I could have sharpened my critique with a quotation from Clifford Geertz, but that I had given up quoting Geertz for Lent. In my dissertation, I investigated John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as conduits of American political thought in Europe, where they were serving as foreign ministers in the 1780s. This research left me resistant to the Republican revision for two reasons. Adams and Jefferson did not inhabit the same intellectual universe, so I doubted that classical republicanism could be seen as a worldview in the anthropological sense of the term. And what Jefferson did believe about human beings offered a striking alternative to Adams's gloomy strictures. A controversy ensued. I argued for the presence of a liberal orientation existing alongside the recovered civic humanism. For me, liberalism had entered American consciousness as a potent brew blended from 17th century entrepreneurial attitudes and the Enlightenment's endorsement of liberty and reason. Because nature had endowed human beings with the capacity to think for themselves and act on their own, representative government seemed the perfect fit for them. Rather than classical republicanism's fixation on social traumas, liberalism was optimistic, moving forward with a rational, self-improving individual who was endowed with natural rights to be exercised in a widened ambit of freedom. Jefferson was my witness. The rights of one generation will scarce be considered hereafter as depending on the paper transactions of another, he asserted. Addressing Shays' rebellion, he insisted that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. On language, he was equally venturesome. I consider purism as destroying the verve and beauty of language, while neology improves both and adds to its copiousness. As Adams wryly observed when Jefferson shared some of his beliefs, your taste is judicious in liking better the dreams of the future than the history of the past. It was a rousing academic debate that lasted about 5 years. I came away with it with the awareness that you get the most out of a controversy when you engage with people whom you greatly admire. The result was a richer understanding of the influences playing upon the revolutionary elite. For me, it was also a personal lifeline. Andy and I were teaching at San Diego State together when a heart attack felled him. After his death, I was invited to join the faculty at UCLA, where I taught for 20 years. Reading Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism opened me to another major historiographical shift. I had been pondering the stuff of consciousness, how it gets into the stream of events that we know as history. And during this cogitation, I encountered this arresting line from Weber. A man does not by nature wish to earn more and more money, but simply to live as he is accustomed to live and to earn as much as is necessary for that purpose. I read that sentence over and over with tingling excitement. To get a feeling for the cognitive dissonance Weber's statement caused in me, we need to retrieve the historical reasoning that swung on the hinge of progress. Smith and other Scottish intellectuals had created a conjectural history for mankind, showing them moving from societies of hunters and gatherers to shepherds to farmers to the commercial men and women of their era. It was a seamless scheme showing the ineluctable advance of human civilizations. Westerners had settled into the conviction that time's natural course was progressive. Well into the 20th century, industrialization was treated as a destination like a city towards which all historical roads led. Scholars largely ignored any taste or habit from the past that didn't contribute to the march forward. Our histories were Whiggish and proleptic, depicting men and women as straining towards a better future. But not Weber. He recognized that the culture of pre-capitalist societies had thrown up impediments to any kinds of change. What others saw as the working out of an inexorable destiny, he characterized as a highly improbable development demanding analysis. The implicit follow-up question to Weber's claim was that if men by nature were not eager to earn more and more money, how had they become so? His answer was a cluster of unintended consequences. Protestants had intruded their strenuous morality into every nook and cranny of customary society, using the scalpel of reason to cut away the accretions of popish religion along with the lethargy of habit. Their rational approach to action, enhanced by a fierce anxiety about salvation, transformed work habits wherever they prevailed, leading to the novel spirit of capitalism. More provocative to me than Weber's thesis was his insight that men and women didn't and don't have emotional attachments to the future, but rather to their present and the near past. Change didn't beckon, it agitated. Self-improving individuals hadn't ushered in modernity. Mutually reinforcing developments had, but historians weren't particularly good at explaining processes. Very fortuitously, the social sciences came to their rescue. H. Stuart Hughes' article, The Historian and the Social Scientist, immortalized in a Bobbs Merrill reprint, gives us a good sense of the zeitgeist in 1963. Hughes had spent a year at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, where he learned things that he thought other historians should know. With a convert zeal, he set out to get his peers to adopt some social scientific techniques, such as model building. The gingerly way he approached the task of educating them amuses in retrospect. After a dozen pages talking about Ronca, Dilthey, Croce, and Collingwood, Hughes finally tiptoed up to the question of how the concepts of social sciences might be applied to history. Despite historians' attachment to the particular, Hughes adroitly pointed out, they were already using generalizations implicit in the words industrialization, revolution, and nation. Going further, he boldly recommended investigating opinion surveys, sampling devices, and content analysis. As it turned out, Hughes was pushing on an open door. Graduate students were already there. We can imagine him quickly stepping aside to avoid the crush of young quantifiers hurrying to their IBM punch cards. With computers and very good eyes, these young people had started poring over long-term data sets, like parish records of births, marriages, and deaths, manifests of ships carrying immigrants, slave sale billings, city directories, and tax rolls. Social scientific theorizing about social mobility, demographic regimes, and class structure supplied historians with hypotheses to test. The new social historians prepared a feast of information about the lives of immigrants, slaves, women, and laborers. Mastering techniques beyond the ken of their mentors, they gave voice to the voiceless in their histories from the bottom up. Where their elders had hid behind the omniscient author, social historians carefully detailed each step in their research. I fully expected one day to read an article that began with directions to the Newberry Library. Still, their emphasis upon making explicit their procedures raised the consciousness of the entire discipline. These ardent quantifiers coined the ultimate put-down by calling the resources of their seniors literary evidence. The old guard complained that they had disrupted the storyline of the rise of the United States. "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone," they moaned. Later came the realization that we had attained a fuller, more inclusive narrative of the American experience. For me, social science methods were most rewarding when applied to England's pioneering of a capitalist economy. Once the assumption of inexorable progress was no longer there to glide over the questions of how and why, modernization became a mammoth puzzle. How had communities immured in custom, ruled by hereditary hierarchies, and limited by economies of endemic scarcity, managed to vault over the walls that protected against change? Let me instance two conundrums. Industrialism could never have taken place without dramatic improvements in agriculture, because feeding the people in a traditional society took upwards of 80% of the society's labor and funds. Only if farmers could increase their crop yields while using fewer workers and less capital could people and investments pass to manufacturing and marketing. Altogether a tall order, especially for country folk who are least likely to innovate. Finely honed inquiries about land management and rural practices specified how it happened, only to present another riddle. Why didn't larger harvests lead to the additional bursts that would trigger the Malthusian trap? Painstaking research uncovered the answer. Family reconstitution, parish by parish, revealed a pattern of late age at marriage typical throughout Europe. This had put a lid on population growth. In a striking departure from mores elsewhere around the globe, European bridal couples did not move in with their families to create an extended family. Society prescribed independent households, so young people delayed marriage until the groom could support a family. It would be hard to exaggerate how mind-expanding it was to approach people in the past as moving unprepared into an unknown future. In my field of early America, a fresh look at the intentions of the country's charter colonists replaced the assumption that the United States had been born free, rich, and modern. Historians now attended to the extraordinary efforts made to transplant Old World traditions into New World settlements. I had always loved reading social theory. I once joked that my 4x6 note cards, if laid end to end, would go from Frankfurt to Los Angeles and back again. When Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault burst upon the academic scene, I was intrigued. With the Enlightenment legacy in their sights, each philosopher, in his own way, sought to destabilize the foundations of thinking in the modern West. The philosophes has sought a total break with absolutist monarchies, church-dominated education, and institutional cruelty. In short, the infamy of the old regime. They convinced contemporaries and their intellectual heirs that nature offered the best guide to the proper ordering of human affairs, and that reason could discern the difference between truth and falsehood in the social realm as well as the physical universe. Commenting on this faith a century later, Friedrich Nietzsche announced that to look upon nature as if it were proof of the goodness and care of God, and to interpret history as a constant testimony to a moral order was now past because it had conscience against it. But his perceptions and those of a few other chafing in the Enlightenment straitjacket did not ignite a rebellion. In retrospect, it appears that 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the Cold War, held at bay a critique of Enlightenment verities for another century, making it all the more forceful when it finally arrived in the 1980s. Foucault and Derrida, joined by others such as Richard Rorty and Hayden White, didn't so much kill the Enlightenment as write its obituary. They replaced the autonomous individual with the subject. They raised the problematic consistency of the self. Men and women were probed as repositories of their society's culture. Rejecting the idea that power was knowledge, they turned upside down that Baconian observation with insistence that social power determined the people's knowledge. Where historians in the Enlightenment tradition saw continuous processes of development, postmodernists discovered ruptures and discontinuities. The social glue of language became unstuck for them. Words suffered from an indeterminacy of reference. They no longer moored reality because they lacked the capacity to represent the external world. Words could only point to other texts or discourses. Language should certainly not play the role of a value-free instrument for representing things outside its purlieus. Out too went authorial intent. For the gaps, transgressive possibilities, and unintended indicators in a text led to a multiplicity of readings. We do not speak language, Derrida maintained, but rather language speaks us, imposing its particular logic. As I was taking all this in, the Mellon Foundation waved $40,000 in front of me with an invitation to address what it considered the problem of postmodernism slowing history graduate students' progress towards their degree. I promised a seminar that put postmodernism in historical perspective. I didn't think postmodernism was affecting the time to degree, but rather that history graduate students weren't familiar with postmodernism's neologies that they would certainly encounter when they got a job and mingled with colleagues in the literature department. Teaching that seminar 3 times prepared me to respond positively when my dear friends Margaret Jacob and Lynn Hunt suggested that we write a book that would offer an antidote to the vertigo postmodernism had induced among our peers. Historians, after all, had more at stake in these issues than literary scholars who apply themselves to text. We reconstruct events, lives, and developments that actually happened. Our tact in telling the truth about history was to juxtapose postmodernism's skepticism about the correspondence notion of truth against positivism's certainty of it, and then pull out from these extremes a via media. We called it practical realism. Abandoning Bacon's notion that the eye was a mirror reflecting reality, we argued that historians' shared goal of achieving accuracy and completeness acted as a constant pressure to get things right during their rigorous interrogation of evidence. This professional ethic, bolstered by the freedom of speech in a democracy, we claimed, acted as a safeguard against history's becoming a mere discourse. Historians have to deal with a vanished past, but they use records outside of texts, such as burial sites, city layouts, carbon dating, and aerial photographs, like those that reveal the arrangement of farmers' fields to Marc Bloch, writing his masterpiece on French rural history. Readily giving up the idea of scientific methods, we acknowledge the benefits stemming from postmodernism's searing critique of language use, but we also kept in mind the horror of being imprisoned in the present. Historians rarely devise theories, they borrow them, but our attachment to empiricism means that we often return them the worse for wear. Postmodernism presented an altogether different challenge from that posed by the social construction of reality, or of explicating modernization without the aid of Whiggish assumptions about progress. Yet all three encounters showcased historians at their best, capable of sloughing off outworn meta-narratives and seeking help from other disciplines, while maintaining a collective equilibrium in the presence of academic earthquakes. I've learned that writing and teaching the history of one's own country represents a special intellectual enterprise, unlike that of studying Germany or China or Nigeria. The difference lies in the fact that with the history of the United States, a relatively open-ended inquiry collides with the vigilant censors of national self-interest. The nation, through its various official and unofficial representatives, cannot be indifferent to what we academic scholars say about the American past, because our shared understanding, yours and mine, of what it is to be an American grows out of what we believe to be true of our nation's history. The anthropologist Mary Douglas has put the case well. Any institution that is going to keep its shape needs to control the memory of its members, and therefore it causes them to forget experiences incompatible with its righteous image, and it brings to their minds events which sustain that view that is complementary to itself. Events proved her right. The findings of the social historians were not received as happily among politicians and pundits as they were in the academy. The hard, often bitter stories of slaves, women, laborers, immigrants, and other outliers undermine the heroic story of the American nation. Certainly the United States Senate felt that way the day it passed a resolution condemning the National History Standards of 1996. Edited by my colleague Gary Nash, the standards had brought to their attention the path-making research of the last quarter centuries. The senators did not appreciate newcomers like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth popping up in their kids' history texts. This is an old fault line, one that I had explored in my first public speech and addressed to the local Unitarian Church in 1965. I chose the topic of American shared values and how they abraded politics. My remarks drew upon a quip from Martin Diamond. He said that the history of the United States could fruitfully be taught as the American legacy and the fight among the heirs. That Sunday, I spoke of the tensions between those who valued equality but esteemed freedom more and their mirror opposites. Common convictions did not ameliorate feelings. Instead, they exacerbated them. This fight among the heirs of the American legacy can be traced to the origins of our nation. Americans in 1776 had to create a sense of nationhood which other countries inherited. I saw this with sharp clarity during a year spent in France. My elder son went to a French school where geography figured prominently in the curriculum. His geography text featured a centerfold picture of pairs of men and women strung out like paper dolls. At the far left, the man and boy, obviously father and son, were dressed in contemporary clothes. The father was holding the hand of the next boy, who was in knickers and knee-high boots, and he was holding the hand of his father in a 1940s double-breasted suit. The next pair evoked the fashion of the turn of the 20th century, and so on, ending with a man of the Carolingian age in a doublet and hose. This schoolboy's text graphically captured the essence of French nationhood. It sprang from this unbroken chain of fathers and sons who had lived long in the land and propagated. Think of the contrast with the United States on the eve of independence. Americans had not only not lived long in the land they lived in had belonged to other people, many of them still living on terrain that the new nation coveted. So they relied instead on the affirmation in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My story of discovering that journalism was not for me probably made history sound like a second choice. But in the ensuing 53 years, I have realized that it was the one calling that could make my life coherent. I enjoy history's straddling of the humanities and the social sciences. Aristotle said in the Poetics that the dramatist must make the possible appear probable. For historians, the challenge is to make the actual believable. At the same time, historians eschew the precision of social scientists by staying true to the unpredictability and messiness of the remembered life. This relationship between memory and history is tangled. Our own recollections contain but a small patch of what happened, so history must supply the deficiency of memory. But history is not memory. The past as a series of events is utterly gone, and its consequences have become incorporated into the present. What lingers on are the material traces and written records, what historians turn into evidence with their questions. These never speak for themselves, yet some traces lie close enough to the surface to be uncovered by the errant investigator who strays from the beaten track or tract. And then, like hastily buried treasure or poorly planted landmines, they deliver shocks. Remembering and forgetting determine the history we tell. It also could be said that history orders the chaos of the past through stories that create meaning. When historians look back on their careers of history writing, and yes, lifetimes of learning too, they are lucky if they can feel good about the chaos defied and the hope in the narrative told.